Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Friday, August the 20th, 2021. I thought I would start today by talking, about the United States of BlackRock. This is from a post by Sundance on theconservativetreehouse.com. With Joe Biden in the White House, you can expect to hear the name BlackRock in the headlines, connected to a variety of issues from real estate purchasing to green energy projects with massive domestic and international investments. BlackRock, Inc., together with its subsidiaries, is a massive publicly traded multinational investment firm with over $8.68 trillion in assets under management. Yes, I'll repeat that. $8.68 trillion in assets under management as of its December the 31st, 2020 financial statement in more than 100 countries across the globe. To say that BlackRock is invested in globalism, climate change, and leftist politics would be a severe understatement. Larry Fink is the CEO, and people like Cheryl Mills, Hillary Clinton's attorney of record, are on the board. Inside BlackRock, there is a division called the BlackRock Investment Institute. Essentially, the role of the BII is to tell BlackRock what is going to happen around the globe and be the tip of the spear in directing BlackRock where to invest money by predicting political events. The chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute is Tom Donilon, President Obama's former national security advisor and a key advisor to Joe Biden throughout his career in politics. You cannot get more deeply connected in the swamp financial schemes than Tom Donilon. Donilon has been around government for 35 plus years, deeply connected. Before joining the Obama administration, Donilon was a registered lobbyist from 1999 through 2005 for O. Melvney and Myers. Tom's sole client was Fannie Mae. Fannie Mae is a government-backed private corporation that sells mortgages to investors. Donilon took the lobbying gig because it was previously executive vice president for law and policy at Fannie Mae, where he was responsible for Fannie Mae's legal, regulatory, government affairs, and public policy issues. Tom Donilon's BlackRock biography reads like a who's who of connections to the swamp. Here's where it really gets interesting. Tom Donilon's brother, Mike Donilon, is a senior advisor to Joe Biden, providing guidance on what policy should be implemented within the administration. Mike Donilon guides the focus of spending, budgets, regulation, and White House policy from his position of senior advisor to the president. Tom Donilon's wife, Catherine Russell, is the White House personnel director. In that position, she controls every hire in the office of the presidency. Tom Donilon's daughter, Sarah Donilon, who graduated college in 2019, now works on the White House National Security Council. So let me just summarize this. The chairman of the BlackRock Investment Institute, the guy who tells the $8.7 trillion investment firm BlackRock where to put their money, has a brother who is the senior advisor to Joe Biden, has a wife who is the White House personnel director, and has a daughter who is now on the National Security Council. Put another way, Tom Donilon's literal job description for BlackRock is to leverage the firm's expertise and generate proprietary research to provide insights on the global economy, markets, geopolitics, and long-term asset allocation. And his wife is in charge of White House personnel. His brother is senior advisor to the president, and his daughter is on the National Security Council. You see this? The only thing missing is Hunter Biden being the bag man. Now, I say again, watch where BlackRock and Biden put their money. A correspondent sent me this this morning. I'm going to make a little joke first. No, the United States has not become a hereditary oligarchy. Why do you ask? As I say, a correspondent sent me this morning. BlackRock Investment Institute is a huge make-work program for politicians' wives and kids to keep BlackRock on the right side of DC in perpetuity. And if their kids want to rebel or be Trustafarian Greens, they can work at BlackRock-sponsored nonprofit shtick for the environment or Africa or whatnot. Yes, a very cozy arrangement. But wait, there is more. And a few months ago, I reviewed a book by Stephen Sukup called The Dictatorship of Woke Capital, which I will recommend highly to you all again. The introduction begins, what is woke capital? On March 24, 2020, the United States government, which Lincoln famously called the last best hope of Earth, officially launched a partnership with BlackRock, Inc., the world's largest money management firm. With the economy suddenly in shambles, crushed under the weight of global coronavirus pandemic and associated social distancing measures, the Federal Reserve desperately needed help navigating uncharted territory and administering and managing its brand new corporate bond programs. And in its hour of need, the Jerome Powell-led Fed turned to Larry Fink and BlackRock. It was an interesting, if unsurprising, choice for the Fed. BlackRock was already the undisputed king of the financial services world. More to the point, over the several previous months, it had also become one of the world's largest and most powerful advocates of what Fink called, quote, a fundamental reshaping of finance, unquote. If anyone could help the Fed and help the nation, then it would seem that Larry Fink was the man. The interesting thing is that Fink made his declaration on reshaping finance several weeks before he was tapped by the Fed and before he met with President Donald Trump, who later called him one of the smartest people we, the nation, have working to fix all our problems. Even before the coronavirus cratered the stock market and the American economy, Fink was already busy finding ways to fix what he saw was as broken, which included a great deal more than the fallout from a mere virus. Fink planned to reshape finance, not just to save the country, but to save the world as well. You see, Larry Fink is a born-again fundamentalist. He's not a fundamentalist in the sense that market observers and participants might expect, i.e. someone with a deep and abiding dedication to market fundamentals or company fundamentals. Rather, Larry Fink is a religious fanatic, a believer in search of the pure fundamental practice of his faith. Or at the very least, by the start of 2020, he decided to play one on TV. Fink had been building to a public profession of his faith for several years, and in late January, even as COVID-19 was already ravaging Wuhan, China, he made it official in a letter to clients of his firm and a concurrent letter to CEOs. We believe, Fink professed, that sustainability should be our new standard for investing. In doing so, Fink not only expressed his own belief in the importance of sustainability, but he also assuaged what he said were customers who had told him they were extremely worried about climate change. These customers had told him, apparently, that they worried not merely about the physical risk associated with rising global temperatures, but about how the global transition to a low-carbon economy could affect a company's long-term profitability as well. He heard their cries and responded as a fellow believer. Conveniently enough, by embracing sustainability as the value by which investments should be measured, Fink also allied himself with the best and the brightest in the worlds of economics and finance, the great global institutions, the United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the self-identified guardians of the post-war global order. He aligned himself with the Federal Reserve, which had already begun investigating the process by which it could factor climate change into its lending practices. Perhaps most notably, he aligned himself specifically with the Fed chairman, Jerome Powell, who 12 years earlier had founded the Global Environment Fund, a private equity firm focused on sustainable energy and investments. I believe they call this doing well by doing good. But what else is BlackRock up to? From Chapter 8, the players, Part 1, on the left. With the battle space identified and the field ready for action, identifying the combatants becomes the next critical job. This is a massively lopsided war. It is perhaps unfair to use this comparison and thus appear to besmirch the American soldiers who freed political prisoners and rescued American medical students, or conversely, to appear to praise the new jewel communists. But the battle space on this issue shapes up very much like the United States military versus the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada. The disparity in resources and firepower is staggering. One side has all the money and all the weapons, while the other has only its determination and the forces of righteousness on its side. And now to BlackRock specifically. Think as a crusader, a man on a mission who is bound and determined to use his power that other people's money, your money perhaps, gives him to impose his beliefs on the capital markets and by extension on the nation more generally. BlackRock is known as one of the big three passive asset managers in the world, along with Vanguard and State Street. This is a true description, but it's also incomplete with its nearly 5 trillion assets under passive management, i.e. index funds, ETFs, makes it the largest passive manager in the world. The firm also has significant assets under active management. Indeed, the roughly 2.5 trillion it has under active management would, in and of itself, make BlackRock the 6th largest asset manager in the world. BlackRock is, in other words, a monster. It is a monster in the passive management business, a monster in the active management business, and a monster that public companies can hardly ignore. As part of the big three, BlackRock has immense and almost shocking power to affect change at whatever companies it chooses to change. And the firm's CEO is a crusader, a fanatic who intends to use this power to go set the world on fire, as St. Ignatius Loyola may or may not have told his Jesuits. This raises a host of very serious concerns for investors, for consumers, for companies, and indeed for American democracy. For starters, the big three, of which BlackRock is the biggest, holds on average about 22% of the typical S&P 500 company. This includes 18% of Apple shares, 20% of Citigroup, 18% of Bank of America, 19% of JP Morgan Chase, and 19% of Wells Fargo. This gives them immense leverage. Moreover, the fact that the last three names above just happen to be the first, third, and fourth largest wealth management firms in the United States amplifies their power to dominate shareholder decisions exponentially. Indexers have always insisted that the combined power they wield is irrelevant. We aren't necessarily aligned on issues, they say, and we certainly don't coordinate, except that now they do. On ESG concerns, BlackRock and State Street are nearly perfectly aligned, and they don't need to coordinate because their ESG research and proxy advisory services, see Bloomberg and ISS, do the coordination for them. And Vanguard, the third of the big three, is not far behind them. Additionally, BlackRock is one of the largest American investors in the People's Republic of China and would very much like to expand its operations there. BlackRock is also heavily invested in Chinese companies and various other companies that do business in China, some of which would never pass Larry Fink's religious precepts if they were American companies. And BlackRock, it wields its clout to essentially order businesses to become woke or else. And when you look at the connections that BlackRock has with the Biden administration, one could really ask the question, is BlackRock the president of the United States now? This is an exceedingly sinister situation. I mean, Andrew Carnegie or JP Morgan had nowhere near as much power as BlackRock does. But the connections between the Biden administration and BlackRock, just a conservative site, a fringe site, if you will, like the conservative treehouse. Well, you're going to learn it from there because the mainstream media simply not interested. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dan, Anrun, Pubcasso 88. Anrun, who says BlackRock sounds like something from one of the Bourne movies. Yes, it does. Hello to Clownvelt. Clownvelt says that BlackRock is the obsidian mirror which devours the soul of America. Chocokin 666. Hello to Oscar Toe. Well, thank you for your praise, Clownvelt. Yes, Fink, a name you can trust. Of course, it's German for Finch. His given name is actually Lawrence, which is a fine name indeed. Going officially by the name Larry doesn't seem to inspire trust, although others might disagree. Now, I understand lots of people are called Lawrence, that their friends call them Larry, but it smacks of I'm just a regular guy. And Larry Fink, of course, is not a regular guy. Isn't BlackRock buying up all the middle-class housing at above-market rates? I believe it is involved in that. Pay no attention to the invisible hand, says Clownbelt, which is doing something terrible to you. Palpcasso88 says, Larry, the finance guy. Yeah. He graduated with an MBA in real estate. That's really a thing? Let's go to Jim Kunstler's column. Joe Biden will interrupt his movable vacation, for now back in Wilmington, Delaware, to speak to the nation early this Friday afternoon. Will he dig himself deeper into the hole that the Taliban tossed him in, or just throw in the towel on running the executive branch of the government, if that's what he's been doing? Let's face it, Joe B's actual doings in the White House these 7 months are as mysterious as last week's blitzkrieg through Afghanistan by the Taliban. What does old white Joe actually do all day after his managers call a lid on his official duties at 8:30 in the morning? Gab with Hunter about family business on a secure phone? Watch a Joyce Behar and her gang on TV? We the people are unaware that the president has any hobbies or avocations. Golf? Apparently not. Stamps? Please. Or does he just sit in a comfortable chair on the second floor, casting what is left of his mind back on those dear dead days of his fabled Scranton boyhood? Can you really imagine Kamala Harris in the Oval Office? I doubt Kamala herself can. Anyway, someone up and dispatched her off to Singapore and Vietnam this week, as if on cue. Get her out of town pronto. Things will be a little hairy around here. Presumably, she will return to the USA in the fullness of time, without any untoward accidents involving Air Force Two. But what if the Veep, for reasons of her own, say nerves, throws in the towel too? Who else happens to be constitutionally in line for commander-in-chief in case the whole 2020 ticket bows out? Why, the Speaker of the House, of course. Nancy Pelosi, the world's leading model of outfit-matching face masks. What a career capper that will be. Better stock up the White House freezer with Jenny's brand mango cheesecake swirl gourmet ice cream and gird your loins for a fusillade of executive orders, making outlaws of everyone living between the Falls of the Potomac and the Embarcadero. The news media may wonder whether Afghanistan is heading back into the 12th century, but many of us here are wondering whether this country will remain in the 21st. The cable TV channels crackle with existential angst. The USA seems to have made itself the chump of chump nations. We are so easily faked out. Our gazillion-dollar military and intel community got owned by savages in sandals, for God's sake. 10,000 Americans or more sit stranded in Kabul while Pashtun horsemen joyride above the city in purloined Black Hawk helicopters. We abandon our allies and obligations. We are not to be trusted even by ourselves. What is to be done? Nobody knows, or if they do, they're not telling. One senses a descent into a season of extraordinary national disorder. Jimmy Carter was undone by a mere 52 hostages in Iran in 1979, but this fiasco was orders of magnitude greater. The Taliban could easily put an end to the whole question of extracting the thousands of Americans stuck in Afghanistan by just firing a few RPG rounds onto the runway of Hamid Karzai International Airport. After that, would they go about the grisly business of beheading any Afghani who so much as took a stick of gum from an American? Part of empires, indeed. Rome waited a few centuries to collapse, but America seems to be demonstrated we can get her done in just a couple of years. And beyond these questions of global hegemony, there is the matter of what happens here in the so-called homeland. The COVID-19 vaccine and masking hysteria is coming to a head. The school boards are getting an earful about race-based everything in the curriculum. Certain state governors and mayors seem to determined to destroy what remains of small business. A mutiny is brewing against Bill de Blasio's new semi-lockdown in New York City. Gavin Newsom is about to be tossed into the North Pacific Gyre. At any moment, the Arizona election audit will issue a preliminary report said to be shocking. Financial markets are in the wobble zone. Supply lines are down for many parts of things needed to run daily life in this land. And millions are wondering anxiously now, what really are the latent effect of those jabs? Things are shaking loose all over the place. As Bob Dylan once said, the order is rapidly fading, and he's even older than Joe Biden. Everyone I know has got the heebie-jeebies. Nobody is at the control of this outfit as we sail into the fog. Now, of course, the media is in the tank for Joe Biden, even though there have been some discouraging words heard about him, because even the regime media understands that after what happened in Afghanistan and the Biden administration's response to it, questions must be asked. This is from Ryan Saavedra at the Daily Wire. ABC News appears to have not aired 900 plus words from Biden during the interview on Good Morning America. Here they are. And the accusation is that ABC removed these words because they did not make Joe Biden seem presidential. Here are some of them. I think this is George Stephanopoulos speaking. I think a lot of Americans and even a lot of veterans who served in Afghanistan agree with you on the big strategic picture. They believe we had to get out. But I wonder how you respond to Army Special Forces officer Javier McKay. He did 7 tours. He was shot twice. He agrees with you. He says, we have to cut our losses in Afghanistan. But he adds, I just wish we could have left with honor. Biden responded, look, that's like asking my deceased son, Bo, who spent 6 months in Kosovo and a year in Iraq as a Navy captain, then as an Army major. And, I'm sure he had regrets coming out of out of Iraq. He had regrets to how's it going? But the idea, what's the alternative? The alternative is, why are we staying in Afghanistan? Why are we there? Do you think that the one, who's most disappointed in us getting out? Russia and China. They'd love to continue to have to. Yes. What are they doing now, says Biden? They're cooperating, letting American citizens get out, American personnel get out, embassies get out, etc. But we're having some difficulty in having those who helped us when we were in there. Stephanopoulos says, we don't really know what's happening in Kabul. Biden says, well, we do know generically and in some specificity what's happening outside of Kabul. We don't know it in great detail. Oh, some specificity, but not in great detail. But we do know. And guess what? The Taliban knows if they take on American citizens or American military, we'll strike them back like hell. Won't have it. Stephanopoulos asks, well, how about our Afghan allies? We have 80,000 people. Biden says, well, that's not the... Stephanopoulos says, is that too high? Biden says, that's too high. Stephanopoulos says, how many? Biden says, the estimate we're giving is somewhere between 50 and 65,000 folks total, counting their families. Oh, yes. And then he talks about Taiwan. This is, and it's rather unfortunate, from ABC News. I don't know how you could leave Afghanistan without chaos ensuing. Biden doesn't think it could have been handled better. This man is falling apart before our eyes. And State Department spokesman Ned Price hails the unprecedented effort, he said, the Biden administration had undertaken to rescue Americans trapped behind Taliban enemy lines in Afghanistan. The United States government doesn't know how many there are, doesn't know where they are, has no plan to get them out, and has said that Americans are not going to be given priority over foreigners. And insult to injury. This is from Jordan Davidson at The Federalist. President Joe Biden's administration is telling Americans who are stranded in Afghanistan to pay for their own passage back to the U.S. Repatriation flights are not free, and passengers will be required to sign a promissory loan agreement and may not be eligible to renew their U.S. passports until the loan is repaid, the Overseas Security Advisory Council noted in its security alert for Afghanistan. The cost may be $2,000 American or more per person. Here is a piece on offthereservation.com, and it is called Generation GWAT and the Fall of Afghanistan. GWAT meaning the Global War on Terror. Some of you Afghan veterans out there are hurting trying to make sense of what this all means, including some of my peers who are not immune to the feel-bads coming out of this clusterfuck. So allow me to give you a different perspective, one that will perhaps soothe the pain a bit. I shoot straight, and this isn't all sunshine and roses. There's going to be some grim dark up front, but it does have a silver lining. Hear me out. Was this a foolish mission to begin with? Yes. The only way to decisively win in Afghanistan was full-scale genocide, which is what I have been saying from the beginning, which we knew from about 2003 forward. We don't have the stomach for that, and that is probably a good thing. Did we lose? Yeah, goddamn right, we lost. Let's just get that out of the way now, like ripping off a Band-Aid. Is it your fault? No. The failure here, while stunning, rests on the political class and the generals. So like I said, the political class. Who exactly do you think lost this war? You, out slogging the mountains and mowing down Taliban fighters with a machine gun and surviving on fish sticks and MRE crackers at the fire base and winning every tactical level engagement for 20 years? Or the spineless general who didn't hear a gunshot despite 9 tours, who was the architect of the grand strategy and spent his time, I'm not going to repeat the rest of this sentence, but it has to do with that general who got in big trouble for spilling his guts to the sexy reporter lady. We can safely say at this point that the real goal in Afghanistan was a transfer of wealth from the taxpayers to the military-industrial complex and the politicians they bought with the profits. $88 billion for the Afghan National Army alone is a staggering figure. For that much money, you could have paid half of Afghanistan to kill the other half. You could have paid China or India or even Pakistan to do it for you. That money was wasted, and we all knew that a decade ago. The idea of spending $2.2 trillion to export our way of life to cavemen is retarded, and anyone with an ounce of sense knows that. I often said that giving the Gans a Jeffersonian democracy was a fool's errand since we could barely keep one functioning ourselves. How many company-grade officers were relieved of command or run up on charges over 20 years? A lot. Hundreds, if not thousands. How many generals faced the same fate or resigned in disgrace over their incompetence? None. Stan McChrystal resigned for saying not nice things about Obama to a Rolling Stone reporter, but that doesn't count. In fact, perhaps it is telling that General JSOC himself was played in such a manner. If old Stanley is too much of an effing idiot not to effectively give his enemy kryptonite and ask him nicely not to use it, what does that say about the rest of the officer cast? For that matter, how many children did the CEO of Raytheon or Boeing or Lockheed Martin lose to the meat grinder? And more on this subject. This is from Boniface Option at Substack, and it is called Get Woke, Go Broke, Kabul Edition, the utter humiliation of the globalist American empire. At the moment I write this, the United States is experiencing the worst military humiliation in its history. You might be tempted to think that is hyperbole. That would be a mistake. The fall of Saigon, which may have been the previous record holder, is nothing like what is happening now, but not for the reasons President Biden claimed a month ago. The South Vietnamese government held out for at least a few years after American withdrawal, and then collapsed only after Congress ended foreign aid. The Afghan government, after 20 years of training, infrastructure development, American combat missions to pacify resistance, and tens of billions of dollars of military aid held out for about 3 weeks. Biden was unwittingly absolutely right. There is no comparison whatsoever between this and the fall of Saigon. The fall of Kabul is exponentially worse. Besides the obvious waste of nearly $2.5 trillion, 2,500 American lives, and 20,000 wounded, what makes this so bad for the American regime is that somehow they believe they could totally abandon Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night, and the government they installed and military they bought wouldn't instantaneously fold. No amount of money could make this work. Well, people were saying that at the time, but of course they were accused of being xenophobes, Islamophobes, of being racists. Don't you believe that everyone can have a democratic regime? I mean, don't you? It's an interesting fellow from Sweden called Malcolm Kejejun. I don't know how that is really pronounced. He is half Swedish and half African. And he has he's got burst mattress hair too, kind of like the the English actor, comedian, and director Richard Ayoade, who's a favorite of mine, who is half Nigerian and half Norwegian. He calls himself Tinksorg on the net, and he writes a piece, Farewell to Bourgeois Kings. And he's talking about a subject that we discussed at great length in our discussion of James Burnham's The Machiavellians, that there comes a point when an elite, a ruling elite, simply becomes not fit for purpose and must be replaced. And of course, if there is no alternative elite to replace it, well, that just leaves a revolution. He begins understanding the true significance of events is, at least in some sense, a task best left to historians. Even the fall of the Roman Empire can appear as something akin to the normal state of things for the people living through it. The true historical significance of something is generally only clear well after the fact, and every new generation has its own notion of the true meaning of history. To the people living in Germany in 1450, the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest surely meant something very different, as it did to the German nationalists of the 19th century. For the former, if people thought about the battle at all, it merely represented a particularly nasty defeat suffered by a long-dead empire. To the people struggling to unite the German nation under the banner of a single strong state, the Roman defeat by the Teutons appeared as a prefiguration of their own political and national destiny. The retreat from Afghanistan should not have made the list of big events in history, or at least not the top of it. Yet it has clearly already made its way there, being widely seen as something truly momentous by most, if not all, the people observing it. The reason it shouldn't have had the same connotations as the fall of the Berlin Wall is because it was not only planned in advance and decided upon by the 45th president, not the 46th, but because almost everyone at this point wished for the war to just end. But it is how it is ended that has really thrown back the curtain and shown the world the rot festering beneath. The American withdrawal is a grotesque spectacle laid bare to the eyes of the world in real time thanks to the wonders of modern technology. The Soviet attempt at braving the graveyard of empires could, if one was charitably inclined, at least be construed as some form of tragedy. And the Russians did their best to make the entire thing appear somewhat dignified and solemn. 30 years later, the scene is closer to a black form of comedy. The American withdrawal has turned into a rout of the most desperate sort, with nobody really seeming to be in charge or claiming responsibility. Who will evacuate the American civilians? Who knows? Maybe the plucky Russians could do Uncle Sam a solid. The Russian consular staff is still there, and they didn't flee Kabul by piling into a waiting helicopter after all, and help America's wayward sons and daughters now that America herself seems to have just given up on the job. There may be a deeper aspect to this than a lot of people might perceive at present on the level of pure geopolitics. Embarrassing debacle of America's withdrawal of Afghanistan can serve only to make China more bold in any future confrontation over Taiwan. The American eagle is faltering, and its rivals will not sit idly by for long. But this is probably the lesser of the big consequences of Afghanistan. There is another much more significant implication of the collapse of the American project there, one with much more acute bearing on the immediate future of American society itself. To understand why, it's useful to reflect on a certain political and historical point made by Carl Schmitt in his by now nearly 100-year-old essay, whose English name is often rendered as The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy. The essay is well worth a read in full today, and the reader might be surprised, or maybe not, at how relevant many of the descriptions of the ongoing political crisis in 1923 may seem to us today, nearly 100 years later. The relevant passage, however, deserves to be quoted in full. Quote, "In the history of political ideas, there are epochs of great energy and times becalmed, times of motionless status quo. Thus, the epoch of monarchy is at an end when a sense of the principle of kingship, of honor, has been lost. If bourgeois kings appear who seek to prove their usefulness and utility instead of their devotion and honor, the external apparatus of monarchical institutions can remain standing very much longer after that. But in spite of it, monarchy's hour has tolled. The convictions inherent in this and no other institution then appear antiquated. Practical justifications for it will not be lacking, but it is only an empirical question whether men or organizations come forward who can prove themselves just as useful, or even more so than these kings, and through that simple fact, brush aside monarchy," unquote. What Schmitt is saying here, says Tinksor, is very important, and it might very well end up being the true cost of the Afghanistan debacle. Every ruling class throughout history advances various claims about its own legitimacy, without which a stable political order is impossible. Legitimating claims can take many different forms and may change over time, but once they become exhausted or lose their credibility, that is pretty much it. What Schmitt is saying is that when the legitimating claim for a particular form of elite is used up, when people no longer believe in the concepts of claims that underpin a particular system or claim to rule, the extinction of that particular elite becomes a foregone conclusion. Once Napoleon came along, it became increasingly impossible to actually believe that kings were born to rule and had a right to rule. As such, the only arguments kings were left with in order to be tolerated by their own subjects became practical in nature. Look at how useful this king is. Look at how well his administration runs. Look at how much stuff you're getting out of letting him sit on the throne. But once you are merely left with practical arguments of that kind, as Schmitt rightly points out, your replacement becomes a question of simple empiricism. The moment someone more useful is found, like, say, a president, out you go, never to return. The replacement of Louis XVI with a republic was a world-shattering event. The fall of his nephew, Louis Philippe I, in favor of another republic was a mere formality by comparison. One can get a pretty good understanding of this process if one looks at the Soviet Union. Socialism once had a claim to rule that wasn't merely about washing machines or electricity. Socialism promised, by applying the power unleashed by the Industrial Revolution to the task of solving the human condition as such, to literally create a new form of society, one that represented in a secularized way humankind finally breaking free from the legacy of the fall. A lot of socialists spent the 20s and 30s grappling with the conspicuous non-arrival of this new society. And eventually, the point of socialism got revised down to something much less divine and much more practical. Socialism is better than capitalism because it's just a much better and more efficient way to organize things. That might have seemed a somewhat persuasive claim in the 1960s, but it quickly became impossible to believe. To borrow from Schmitt, first the kings had turned bourgeois, and soon they disappeared. Nikita Khrushchev's claims that the Soviet model would bury the West represented the communists themselves becoming properly bourgeois, in Schmitt's terms. As it turned out, it didn't take too long for them to disappear either. Once your only promise to your citizenry becomes that you'll give them more blue jeans than the Americans, you will live and then die by those blue jeans. Yes, I mean, obviously there's a very big picture look at it. I mean, at what point can one say that a ruling elite has lost its legitimacy? Well, people will argue about this. You remember when Jimmy Carter was president, when he made his famous speech about Malays, which was much mocked. I think he rather had a point, although he wasn't understood at the time. Tinksor concludes, how long will it take for their institutions to disappear or before they end up toppled by popular discontent and revolution? No one can know. But at this point, I think most people on some level now understand that it really is only a matter of time. Someone was pointing out on Twitter some surprise that the tablet, that is to say the Jewish tablet, not the Catholic tablet, seemed pretty woke of late, and they expressed shock at a essay August the 18th by Lee Smith called Asaspia Wins Every Time. 20 years, 2 trillion, and the world's most powerful army were no match for one thing the Taliban has and the current American leadership has lost, and that thing would be tribalism. Yes, for our elite, the fall began during the tail end of the Bill Clinton presidency, when Democratic Party strategists argued they'd soon have a permanent hold on power, thanks to urban intellectuals, young single women, racial and ethnic majorities, and the alphabet people community. What is described as a coalition is in fact a mélange of clients with varying and sometimes opposing interests that can only be held together by stoking a communal hatred of the national majority, the white middle class. It was hardly a coincidence that this demographic was the source of the wealth that the establishment was busy transferring to themselves and abroad through initiatives like NAFTA. The elites rationalized their impoverishment of the white middle class by claiming that they were dying anyway. And when the American heartland didn't die off quickly enough, the establishment credentialed themselves as progressives by calling the people who lived there racists. Being racist, they deserved all the bad things the elite had decided for them. Thus, by betting on sectarianism as the path to permanent power, American elites polarized the United States. Well, they haven't gotten away with it yet. That's my message. Oh, yes, if current trends continue, well, it is not written in stone that current trends continue. Was anyone expecting COVID-19? More to the point, was anyone expecting the hysterical overreaction to it, which is mutilating economies around the world even to this day? No one. Certainly no one expected the last. Michael Rubin has a piece at 1945.com, Don't Ignore the CIA's Intelligence Failure on Afghanistan. Has the CIA ever been right about anything? The short answer is no. No, it's not. The Pakistan-backed multi-pronged Taliban assault is not the only offensive to catch the CIA off guard. Just short of a year ago, Azerbaijan, a country like Pakistan, hosts a significant U.S. intelligence community presence, blindsided the United States when it launched a surprise attack on Nagorno-Karabakh. The CIA never explained that intelligence failure, perhaps saved by congressional distraction with their own elections and the fact that few American journalists witnessed the human tragedy, the Azerbaijani assault. To misread intentions and capabilities so completely raises questions about whether the intelligence community has improved its products and capabilities since its 9/11 failures, or whether it has instead become just another jobs program focused more on playing Washington politics than conducting its core mission well. And there is a piece by Technofog at his, I'm assuming it's his Substack, and it is titled, The Afghanistan Collapse, Americans Died for This, Call It What It Is, Treason. Yes, the neoconservatives were operating under the foolish assumption that exporting democracy will make a bad world good. Only God can do that. The Afghan government was ripping us off. The politicians deceived us about what American sons and daughters were dying for. and our generals were making knowingly false statements about the status of the war in Afghanistan, a revelation to the public after stellar reporting on the Afghanistan papers by the Washington Post. Well, U.S. generals said they were making steady progress with training the Afghan Army and National Police Force. Quote, U.S. military trainers described the Afghan security forces as incompetent, unmotivated, and rife with deserters. In the lessons learned interviews, U.S. military trainers described the Afghan security forces as previously mentioned. They also accused Afghan commanders of pocketing salaries paid by U.S. taxpayers for tens of thousands of ghost soldiers. Nonetheless, every data point was altered to present the best picture possible. Surveys, for instance, were totally unreliable. Yes, concerns about the corruption of the Afghan government were unwelcome. There were a number of faulty assumptions in the strategy. Afghanistan is ready for democracy overnight. The population will support the government in a short time frame. More of everything is better. The single biggest project of the U.S. in Afghanistan may have been corruption. Just pumping a whole heck of a lot of stuff into countries that can't manage it. And then, our single project, sadly and inadvertently, of course, may have been the development of mass corruption. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chair General Mark Milley shrugged all this off. For context, this is the same general who promised on July the 21st, 2021, that the Afghan security forces have the capacity to sufficiently fight and defend their country. There's no mistake these lies were political, but the intent was also self-preservation, bubbling up from the need to hide their own failures so they could escape accountability. They knew that the truth about the corruption and lack of progress would cause public outrage and lead to demands for withdrawal. By the deception, they denied the American people, through or from their elected representatives, their political right to make an informed decision on whether to continue the war in Afghanistan. Neoconservative fantasies. As to the neoconservatives and their circles, one would think that the failure of Afghanistan would cause them to reconsider their promotion of nation-building projects to remake the world in the image of the United States. That they would pause, if even briefly, to think of whether they were wrong about everything. If only that were the case. Bill Kristol demands more sacrifices and clings to the hope that we can deploy forces to Afghanistan, quote, and ultimately turn it around, unquote. Meanwhile, David French is pleading that the United States has a moral and biblical obligation to protect the Afghan people from the Taliban. In doing so, he appeals to the Christian just war doctrine. The audacity and utter cynicism of David French to appeal to concepts of just war after his support of wars of preemption and his defense of the targeted mass incineration of innocent non-combatants. Of course, French and Kristol and the rest of the neoconservative pundits won't suffer the costs of these proposals. They'll just make a good living talking about it. I don't know. I mean, I would have thought, I suppose I was naive, even, almost 20 years ago, that the debacle in Iraq would mean that the neocons were laughed out of Washington, D.C. They were laughed out of the think tanks. They were laughed out of their media purchase. Didn't happen. It just didn't happen. And of course, our malicious elite has produced a crop of lemons, but is determined, as they say, to make lemonade. Because what's the silver lining out of all this? Afghan refugees. Don't you just love them? This is from John Binder at Breitbart. President Biden's administration may balloon the number of Afghans set to be resettled across the United States following the withdrawal of U.S. armed forces from Afghanistan. Days ago, Pentagon officials stated that up to 22,000 Afghans, mostly applying for special immigrant visas, and the newly created P2 visa would be arriving at 3 military bases: Fort Lee in Virginia, Fort Bliss in Texas, and Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. On Thursday, though, refugee resettlement agencies told the Washington Post the number of Afghans seeking evacuation through a U.S. visa program is closer to 100,000 and could be as high as 300,000. Biden has already allocated an additional $500 million to resettle Afghans. Regardless, Biden has ensured that states and local jurisdictions will not have any say in whether Afghans are resettled in their communities. In September 2019, former President Trump issued an executive order that gave state governors, county officials, and local governments the power to veto refugee settlement in their communities. The order was a major win for activists, specifically in Tennessee, which had fought the Obama administration for its dumping of refugees across the state without any input from the governor, mayors, and local citizens. In early February 2020, Biden rescinded Trump's orders. I saw someone on Twitter, some idiot, saying, all these Iranians came to Canada, after 1979, and they're just solid citizens now and tremendous entrepreneurs creating so many jobs. Well, whether or not that's true, Persians are not Afghans. This is from Steve Saylor, new Dutch study of the cost of refugees. James Thompson had written, Western governments have rarely carried out large-scale and detailed analyses of the benefits and costs of immigration with country of origin comparisons. Even now, it is hard to obtain good quality data on immigrants from different countries. For some host countries, even carrying out such analyses was deemed unseemly. Immigration was seen as a fundamentally good policy, which should not be questioned. But the Dutch have looked at this, and let's see, the very worst in terms of them paying in very little and receiving a great deal in return. The Horn of Africa and the Sudan, and then Afghanistan, Iran, Syria and Iraq, Morocco, Central Africa, North Africa, Turkey, the Caribbean, Pakistan. And how much? It is striking that regions where many asylum migrants come from score relatively poorly compared to from surrounding regions. Among European immigrants, people from the former Yugoslavia and the former Soviet Union rely on a relatively large amount of the assistance. In terms of origin, in Asia, this is the case for the region of Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, which is an important area of origin for asylum migrants. Immigrants from the Horn region of Africa and Sudan, also an important source of asylum, do for the largest amount an appeal to social assistance. And this is a lot of money that we are talking about. That over lifetime, yes, here. Immigration from non-Western regions is usually unfavorable for public finances. This applies especially to the areas of origin, Caribbean, West Asia, Turkey, and North Central and West Africa, with net costs running from 200,000 to 400,000 euros per immigrant, and Morocco, the Horn of Africa, and Sudan with net cost of 550,000 to 600,000 euros per immigrant. By way of comparison, an average Dutch native is roughly budget neutral over his or her life. Well, it could be that, here in Canada and in the United States, we have what John Derbyshire famously called magic dirt, and these people will not act here as they do in the Netherlands. Yes, I don't believe that for a second. So, in 1950, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, infamously said that the Korean Peninsula was not part of the so-called defense perimeter of the United States. A few months later, North Korea invaded, and quickly, South Korea was reduced to the Pusan perimeter, and a massive war effort involving the United States primarily, but other countries were involved, was needed in order to push the invaders back. In 1990, April Glaspie, who was ambassador to Iraq, said that the United States government had no interest in Arab disputes. Shortly thereafter, Saddam Hussein overran Kuwait. And now we have a rather extraordinary statement from Joe Biden in his ABC interview. They are entities we've made agreements with based on not a civil war they're having on that island or in South Korea, but on an agreement that they have a unity government that, in fact, is trying to keep the bad guys from doing bad things to them. Okay. There was a paragraph said by the President of the United States, who is a senile idiot. Quote, "We made a sacred commitment to Article 5 that if in fact anyone were to invade or take action against our NATO allies, we would respond. Same with Japan, same with South Korea, same with Taiwan." It's not even comparable to talk about that. This story is from Jack Posobiec at Human Events. In case you are unfamiliar, Article 5 is an agreement which states that an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. As reported by Reuters, a senior Biden official said that the policy has not changed, however, and Biden simply misspoke. Did he misspeak? Is Joe Biden actually the president of the United States? I mean, lots of people doubt it. I mean, this guy cannot speak without saying howlers or by emitting gibberish. Presumably, there are surer hands on the till. Here's a story from the New York Times. Catholic officials on edge after reports of priests using Grindr. Is anyone surprised? In many places in the West, Canada, the United States, England, Europe, Catholic dioceses are a little more than homosexual covens. I mean, it starts in the seminaries, where they call each other by women's names. The report said the Roman Catholic Church in rapid succession analyses of cell phone data obtained by a conservative Catholic blog seem to show priests at multiple levels of the Catholic hierarchy in both the United States and the Vatican using the gay hookup app Grindr. The first report, published last month, led to the resignation of Monsignor Jeffrey Burrell, the former General Secretary of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. The second, posted online days later, made claims about the use of Grindr by unnamed people in an unspecified rectory in the Archdiocese of Newark. The third, published days after that, claimed that in 2018, at least 13 mobile devices emitting dating app data signals from within areas of Vatican City that are off limits to tourists. The reports by the blog, The Pillar, have unnerved the leadership of the American Catholic Church and have introduced a potentially powerful new weapon into the culture war between supporters of Pope Francis and his conservative critics, cell phone data, which many users assume to be unavailable to the general public. The reports have put church officials in an awkward position. Priests take a vow of celibacy that is in no way flexible, and that downloading or use of dating apps by clergy members is inconsistent with that vow. But officials are also deeply uncomfortable with the use of cell phone data to publicly police priests' behavior. Vatican officials said they met with representatives from the blog in June, but would not publicly respond to its reports. There will be no reform in the Catholic Church until the lavender mafia is uprooted, until every single homosexual is expelled. Because the way that it works, it's an affinity network. When you get one anywhere, you get a bunch of others. They recruit people just like them, and then they prey on young men in seminaries. They prey on altar boys, and the cycle of filth continues. This is from International Business Times. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of a Brazilian bishop who quit after an intimate video of him with another man leaked on social media. Tome Ferreira de Silva, the bishop of the Diocese of São José de Rio Preto, submitted his resignation Saturday after acknowledging that he was the man seen in the explicit video. According to the Brazilian news outlet Globo, the video, which leaked on social media Friday, showed a Ferreira half naked, exposing himself and caressing his sexual organ during a video call with another man, and was allegedly engaged in an act of self-gratification. I suppose I don't know that people had actually considered that possible usage of Zoom, but I guess all forms of new technology become quickly sexualized. The narrative is collapsing. This is from the narrative on COVID-19. This is from Alex Berenson's Substack. And the piece is called, "They Are Scared Shitless. What's really behind the vaccine panic? They never promised you a rose garden or herd immunity." Oh, wait, they did. With the vaccines failing, and make no mistake, the vaccines are failing, as the New York Times itself essentially admitted on Wednesday night, the desperation among the public health grandees is palpable. You have to see the video. They're scared shitless. A reader emailed yesterday about the press conference that doctors Anthony Fauci, Rachel Walensky, and Vivek Murthy held to discuss the need for a third vaccine dose. Walensky is the head of the Centers for Disease Control. Murthy is the Surgeon General. And if you don't know Fauci, you probably aren't reading this. Sure enough, they were, especially Fauci. Normally, he is as smooth, as unflappable as Steph Curry shooting a game-winning three. On Wednesday morning, he appeared rattled, almost pale, as he laid out the so-called evidence for a third shot, which basically consists of, "We know it'll make you some antibodies for a month. Let's hope that works." As some physicians who were very much in favor of the initial vaccine rollout are now admitting, pushing a third dose of these powerful mRNA vaccines without clinical trial proof that they will help is a frankly insane way to practice medicine. And there's a tweet attached from Vinay Prasad, MD and MPH. "Boosters are sure to raise antibody titers and stock prices, but I am an old-fashioned doctor and would like to see them lower hospitalization rates." Berenson continues, "What on earth is going on?" Let's put aside the conspiracy theories. I never try to go to a conspiracy when incompetence and or bureaucratic incentives and or panic at bad decisions will suffice. When it comes to vaccines, we have plenty of all three. Understand what is happening with vaccines now means understanding what was happening last fall. Remember the Great Barrington Declaration? Remember Dr. Scott Atlas? A group of top academic epidemiologists was pushing governments to acknowledge the reality that any hope of containing the coronavirus had long passed. In early October 20, they released the Great Barrington Declaration. Its most crucial sentences were these, quote, "We know that all populations will eventually reach herd immunity, i.e. the point at which the rate of new infections is stable, and that this can be assisted by, but is not dependent upon, a vaccine. Our goal should therefore be to minimize mortality and social harm until we reach herd immunity," unquote. Herd immunity is essentially reached when so many people are immune to the coronavirus or any pathogen that large outbreaks are impossible. As the declaration noted, it can be achieved either naturally through infection and recovery or by giving people an effective vaccine. About 6 weeks before the declaration came out, Atlas, a Stanford University radiologist, had become President Trump's top medical coronavirus advisor. He was in close contact with the authors of the declaration. He favored their position. Cases and deaths had fallen sharply from their summer peak. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis had just banned local rules closing businesses and mask mandates on individuals. Much of the country was clearly no longer listening to the public health finger-wagging. Those blue states that continued to do so were at increasing economic disadvantage. But the public health establishment and media insisted that any discussion of naturally generated herd immunity was not just wrong, but immoral. On September the 2nd, the Los Angeles Times wrote, "Coronavirus herd immunity is just another way to say, let people die." But telling people they had to remain in lockdown indefinitely was clearly no longer tenable. Public health advocates needed another solution quickly. They turned to vaccines. When the coronavirus first hit, almost no one believed that coronavirus vaccines would be available. before late 2021 at the earliest. In the infamous March 2020 Imperial College paper that pushed the world towards lockdown by predicting that the virus could kill almost 3 million Americans and Britons without immediate action, Neil Ferguson wrote that he expected a vaccine would take at least 18 months. Other experts put that at the fast end of what was possible. But by October 2020, Fauci and other health officials were sounding much more optimistic. Small clinical trials in the spring and summer had shown the mRNA vaccines produced high levels of antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. Now Pfizer and Moderna were conducting much larger clinical trials of their vaccine. Clinical trials are supposed to be conducted in near complete secrecy. For both ethical and financial reasons, scientists and executives at the drug company sponsoring them are not supposed to know how they are proceeding until they have ended and all the results are compiled. But data safety monitoring boards do have access to some early results. And if a treatment, whether drug or vaccine, is proceeding very well, the imbalance in results between people who are receiving the treatment and those receiving a placebo, no treatment, may become evident even before the trial is complete. In any case, by mid-September, Fauci was becoming increasingly confident that vaccines would soon be available. On September 18th, he told CBS that he expected vaccine clinical trial results by November or December. Let's say it is November, you could start in December. A few days later, he told the Journal of the American Medical Association, by the time we get to November, December, we will be able to start vaccinating people. December, January, February. These predictions from Fauci would prove astonishingly accurate, considering that the trials had begun enrollment only months before. It was as if he had inside information. And so when anti-lockdown proponents began to talk about herd immunity through natural infection and recovery, Fauci was ready. On October 15th, he called naturally generated herd immunity nonsense and very dangerous. In an October 19th tweet, Dr. Walensky would explicitly lay out the public health establishment's position. Quote, herd immunity is a vaccination plan, not an infection plan, unquote. In November, the World Health Organization went even further, explicitly removing any mention of natural immunity from its discussion of herd immunity. Quote, herd immunity, also known as population immunity, is a concept used for vaccination, emphasis added, in which a population can be protected from a certain virus if a threshold of vaccination is reached. Herd immunity is achieved by protecting people from a virus, not by exposing them to it, unquote. In response to criticism that this formulation was a bizarre revision of the concept of herd immunity as epidemiologists had always defined it, the WHO later revised its description yet again, so that it now does mention herd immunity. But we now know that the coronavirus vaccines, at least the current generation of mRNA and other vaccines, cannot produce herd immunity. The clinical trial results that Pfizer and Moderna reported in November, showing 95% protection from infection, vastly overstate their real-world effectiveness. And there is a link here to the bombshell New York Times story. Israel, once the model for beating COVID, faces new surge of infections. One of the most vaccinated societies, Israel now has one of the highest infection rates in the world, raising questions about the vaccine's efficacy. Berenson concludes, and so the grandees have only two choices. Admit they were wrong last year and that the only way to achieve herd immunity is to allow nearly everyone to be exposed to the coronavirus, or put the world back into lockdown as they wait a vaccine that actually works. They won't accept the first. They know the world won't accept the second. And so they have chosen a third, the Hail Mary of boosters, an effort to top up the current vaccines without any real evidence that doing so will work. The risks they're running are incalculable, truly. They don't know what the side effects may be. They don't know if the extra antibodies the vaccine produce will last or for how long. They don't know if a fourth or fifth or sixth dose will be needed and what side effects those might have. They just know they can't admit they were wrong. No wonder they're scared shitless. There is an excellent piece in The Federalist by Kylie Zempel. I'm not going to wear a mask in a county where no one is dying of COVID. There is nothing quite like the feeling of being ordered to do something absurd and being helpless against it. That was exactly the feeling that washed over many residents of Dane County, Wisconsin, Tuesday, when an unelected decision-maker decreed that just 2 days later, a mask would be required for entry into virtually every indoor space. The blow might have been softened and resulting ire lessened if there were any reason to believe this action was going to save lives in the county that's home to Wisconsin's capital city of Madison, but it's hard to improve a daily death average of 0. That inescapable reality that almost nobody is dying of the Wuhan virus in one of the most vaccinated counties in the country, yet breathing uninhibited is verboten, is the premier form of gaslighting from the ruling class of power-drunk elites. For a year and a half, well-meaning Americans have complied with anti-science executive decisions and been scorned when they merely disagreed with the conventional wisdom pouring out of the corporate press. Each time, lawmakers and bureaucrats weaponized private businesses to do their dirty work, ordering them to enforce mask wearing and social distancing and to keep the peasants in line. They got away with all of it, despite the mitigation measures causing catastrophic side effects, such as a waxing mental health crisis, a massive surge in drug overdoses, and a huge blow to the educational and other cognitive development of the next generation, the extent to which we will not possibly be able to ascertain for years to come. Life is a game of trade-offs, and there may be some formula of factors that makes the above trade-offs worth it. But what is Dane County trying to prevent? Whom is it trying to protect? Tuesday's order prompted a look at the numbers, which revealed an incredible sustained black line at 0. 0 deaths for the 7-day average since the middle of May, when the 7-day average was a whopping single death. The last time the weekly average was higher than 1 was before Valentine's Day. Only 1 death has been attributed to coronavirus in this county of more than 500,000 people in the last 2 weeks, with deaths across the entire state down 34% in the same timeline. But don't you know? Wearing a mask shows that you care. You care so much. And that's really the most important thing. This is from Reuters today. U.S. health officials are reviewing reports that Moderna Inc.'s COVID-19 vaccine may be linked to a higher risk of a rare heart condition in younger adults than previously thought, the Washington Post reported late on Thursday, citing people familiar with the review. The review was focused on Canadian data that suggests a higher risk from the shot than the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, especially in men below the age of 30, according to the paper. Well, that's terrible. This is from Thomas Frank at CNBC. Senators Roger Wicker, Angus King, and John Hickenlooper, who are all vaccinated for the coronavirus, tested positive for COVID Thursday after experiencing symptoms. Wicker, Hickenlooper, and King are the latest in a string of prominent politicians to announce positive coronavirus tests in recent weeks, despite being fully vaccinated. Other politicians who have tested positive for COVID despite vaccination include Republican Senators Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Governor Greg Abbott of Texas. It's almost as if, these cases are trying to tell us something. Wouldn't you say? I mean, enough anecdotes eventually becomes a trend. But wait, we're already terrified of the Delta variant. But this from the Charlotte, Ben Sessoms at the Charlotte Observer, Delta is surging, but is another variant on the way? Here's what to know about Lambda. Oh no, there's just no end. There's no end to the terror. You thought Delta was bad? Wait for Lambda. On Government Street, which is a block down for where I am, if you walk south a couple of blocks, you will see construction hoarding. And it's been there for a year and a half, a makeshift shrine to various heroes of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of those heroes is Dr. Bonnie Henry, who is the chief latrinewala of my province of British Columbia. But the same people who were lauding her, there is hagiographic portrait of her, as well as Dr. Theresa Tam. So the same people who were singing her praises, now they are very unhappy with her. They want her gone. They want her gone. And why do they want her gone? Because she's not in panic mode. Not in panic mode. If you say, Eric Feigl Ding, the Dinger. Holy hell, Chief Officer of British Columbia, Chief Health Officer of British Columbia, Dr. Bonnie Henry is caught on camera endorsing no masks, giving a sign to fans shouting no masks. She didn't flinch one bit. Dr. Henry notoriously downplays masks. Here's why BC is the Florida of Canada. Oh my God, I'm so sick of that. And yes, here is Bonnie Smith smiling at a public event. And, making this sign, not that sign. This sign means something else entirely. Fire Bonnie. Oh, dear, dear. So BC's foe is now promoting super spreader events, no mask mandate, no safe school plan, Delta rising exponentially. Cool, Bonnie. Cool. Fire Bonnie is getting international support. D. Fisman, we need your support on this as well. Who is D. Fisman? Oh, David Fisman. Professor interested in plagues and politics. I can't take this, says We Carry On. We need a public health officer who believes masks are effective to combat a pathogen that is airborne and out of control. Fire Bonnie. Yes, to steal a joke or to modify an Alan Partridge joke. These people are carrying on about COVID as if it is liquid AIDS. Nat Bourret, Bachelor of Science, MBA, doctoral candidate. Appreciate your credentialism, lady. I feel sick to my stomach watching this clip. What if a fireman did this exact same gesture behind two people with a lit match while in a very dry forest during a season when forest fires were getting started all over the place? Not fit to lead. Fire Bonnie. And there's Fire Bonnie. And if you just search for Bonnie Henry, you find people going crazy. People going crazy. But what do the numbers say? Oh, also Vancouver Island. Oh my God, Vancouver Island is on the brink. It's absolutely on the brink. And Bonnie Henry isn't doing anything about it. Okay, so latest numbers from British Columbia. Currently hospitalized, 129 people currently in critical care or ICU. Let's confirm that number. Hang on just a second. 59. And once again, how many people live in my province of British Columbia? Let's get the latest numbers here. And it's approximately 5.17 million people. Okay. So over a year and a half, population of almost 5.2 million people, there's 1,785 confirmed deaths. And right now, 129 currently hospitalized, currently in critical care ICU, 59. How about Vancouver Island? What's happening on Vancouver Island? Okay. Currently hospitalized, 8. Currently admitted to ICU, 5. Vancouver Island is approximately 800,000 people. And those numbers indicate barely a pinprick. So how long has this nonsense been going on for? 18 months? 18 months? Total number of deaths on Vancouver Island, 42. That's fewer than 3 deaths a month. Again, barely a pinprick. So what's the trend? Okay, from the official BC government COVID-19 situation report for week 31, August the 1st to August the 7th, 2021. Those are the latest numbers. Deaths have remained low and stable from weeks 26 to 31. Yeah. So it appears that it's not panic stations. It's nowhere near panic stations. No. But there are people who seem to have a vested interest in panic. Vested interest in panic. And how many deaths do we have in British Columbia? Week 31 deaths. 4 in a province of almost 5.2 million people. You know, it's spreading panic, spreading unwarranted panic were a crime. All of these Twitter monsters would be in prison, and in prison for a long, long time. Let's go down to Lockdown Skeptics. Now, dailyskeptic.org. GPs still ignoring orders to allow patients face-to-face appointments. How much easier it will be for physicians when they no longer have to suffer the indignity, indeed the misery of actually having to meet patients. Billionaire investor Sir James Dyson, who owns a portfolio of commercial offices, has called for an end to home working and a return to the office. We already talked about Moderna. Can Australia contain the Delta variant? Well, I don't know. If you're just going to panic and shut everything down, you know, when you find one case, this is going to go on forever. Zero COVID disaster continues as New Zealand extends its lockdown and Sydney places residents under house arrest until October. Revolution, is that coming? Are the people of Australia and New Zealand really going to put up with this? Apple staff told they won't return to the office until 2022. And the implausible findings of the latest Oxford vaccine effectiveness study. And so let's go back to the chat. Anran says to Palcasso 88, you need to switch your regular target from Schumer to Graham. Dionysus says just give the Lions carte blanche and we will clean up everything real nice. Palcasso 88 says the Schumer-Dunham fat jokes were getting tired. Anran says, isn't screaming fire in a crowded theater where there isn't one a crime, at least a misdemeanor? Yes. Dionysus says, get rid of Vatican II. Well, yeah, absolutely. Oh, I see. Someone was making a gay joke about Lindsey Graham. Dan says the variants will have more sequels than a Friday the 13th film. I wonder if there'll be a crossover, you know, like Alien versus Predator. One too many, never ask for whom the bell tolls, etc., says Anrun. Dan says, not surprising, but many supporters of this psyop are ecstatic about booster shots. Clown Velt says, God smiles when KMG laughs. Well, I hope so. Okay. Watch the original Wicker Man, had no idea it was a musical of sorts. Excellent original tunes in that movie. This is one of my very favorite movies. It's absolutely terrifying, and it's really kind of shocking that the hero of our film, played by Edward Woodward, is a conservative Christian. Seven Costanza says, a second shot made me sick for a few days, and I've heard the third is the same. I'd rather just get COVID. Well, I'm sure there's a number of people who think the same. Berkin Sultanov points out that Rio Preto means Black River. Yeah. Much of this is a result of the all-volunteer army. Politicians do not want broad popular resistance, says Berkin Sultanov. Jim Bowden says 95% of people are sheep followers rather than independent thinkers. Perhaps, but you see, they can turn on a dime. That's the thing. Jim Bowen says protesting is not allowed here in Sydney. Yes, someone who organized a protest was sentenced to 8 months in prison. How about that, huh? And let's go to Tainter, to Joseph Tainter, The Collapse of Complex Societies, published by Cambridge University Press in 1988. And he is discussing various complex societies in history which collapsed. The Huari and Tiahuanaco empires. The period between 200 BC and 600 or 700 AD saw the development in Peru of extensive irrigation and agricultural terracing in conjunction with growth of population. True cities were built that were the capitals of regional states. These shared a common heritage of technology and ideology, but were divided by distinctive art styles, separate governments, and competition for food and land. Out of this competitive situation, two empires emerged, those of the Huari in the north and Tiahuanaco in the south. At its height, the Huari Empire dominated almost the entire central Andes and much of the adjacent coastal lowlands. This empire was controlled by the highland city of Huari. In a short time, Huari-derived ceramic styles, themselves influenced by Tiahuanaco wares, appeared in many regions. Early Huari ceramics, like the later Inca wares, tend to occur in politico-religious contexts in ceremonial centers, in cities, and in other high-prestige sites. Molds were used for the mass production of pottery. As these wares spread, local styles began to lose importance. The Huari Empire imposed economic, social, and cultural changes on the areas it dominated. Local cultures were disrupted. Major urban centers were established in each valley. Building complexes in the Huari architectural style, administrative structures, storehouses, or barracks were constructed at various places. Cities rose and fell with the Huari Empire. Goods and information were exchanged across the central Andes on a scale never seen before. Various authors have suggested that urbanism and militarism, state distribution of foodstuffs, the Andean road system, and the spread of the Quechua language began with the Huari Empire. Until recently, the case for a contemporaneous or chronologically overlapping Tiahuanaco Empire was less clear. Since the only detailed work had been at the city of Tiahuanaco itself in the Lake Titicaca Basin, the argument for an empire was by comparison to Huari. Recent work, however, has shown that a large rural hinterland was transformed by the Tiahuanaco rulers into an artificial agricultural landscape. There were massive public reclamation and construction projects that required large coordinated labor forces. Throughout the Lake Titicaca Basin, state administrative structures were built near potentially arable land. The settlement pattern suggests political unification of the basin and the existence of an empire. Tiahuanaco itself may have held between 20,000 and 40,000 persons. In both cases, there was a major collapse by circa 1100 AD. With the fall of the city of Huari, centers in various provinces were abandoned. Regional traditions reemerged, as did local and regional political organizations. All cities of the southern highlands were abandoned and their populations scattered to the countryside. The north coast must have been depopulated. With the fall of the Huari Empire, an era of smaller contending states emerged. The Kachin. The Kachin of highland Burma are a classic people of anthropology. They are organized into three contrasting forms of society. There are the Gumlao, or egalitarian, the Gumsa, or stratified, and the Shan, or feudal. Socio-political complexity and level of hierarchical authority increase through these social forms in the order listed. The noteworthy fact about the Kachin is that these forms are not static. Local groups may oscillate between Gumlao and Shan-like characteristics. Gumsa organizations is a compromise between these two contrasting poles. Some Gumsa become Shan, others revert back to Gumlao organization. Yet equality of descent groups cannot be maintained, and eventually Gumsa societies emerge from the Gumlao. What is most pertinent to the present topic is that stratified Gumsa societies do not remain so. Through disaffection of their members, principles of hierarchy and associated complexity are periodically lost as such societies collapse to egalitarian organization. And I will have more from Tainter, rather, particularly the strange story of the ick of Uganda on Monday. I was going to talk about nostalgia, the tremendous power of nostalgia in our society, but I think I will put that off to Monday, because it is time for the book club. And I saw something on Douglas Street just a couple of hours ago, which I'm going to talk about to introduce my discussion of Theodore Dalrymple's book, Romancing Opiates. Rather extraordinary, a large banner all the way across Douglas Street, and Douglas Street's a very wide street, and it mentioned that there was something coming up, an event, International Overdose Awareness Day, and it has its own colored ribbon. Did you know that? According to Wikipedia, International Overdose Awareness Day is a global event held on August 31st each year. Its purpose is to raise awareness of overdoses, reduce the stigma of drug-related deaths, and acknowledge the grief felt by families and friends. It was initiated in 2001 in Australia by S.J. Finn, who was managing a needle and syringe program at the Salvation Army Crisis Center in St. Kilda, Victoria. It has been run by the Pennington Institute since 2012. So, what do we know about the Pennington Institute? Because I always like to find out about these institutions which no one has ever heard of, which turn out to be important to wield power. And Pennington is one such. I like to know about their sources of funding. Now, Pennington Institute, which is responsible for the International Overdose Day, is a registered charity. But have you ever heard of the Pennington Institute? Do you know of anyone who has ever given money to the Pennington Institute? No, you don't. So where is the money coming from? I'm sure you've figured it out already, right? Thank you to our funders and major donors. This is from the Pennington Institute Annual Review for 2020. Government: Victorian Government Department of Health and Human Services, Australian Government Department of Health. So, two different levels of Australian government give money to a not NGO, which essentially tells them what they want to hear. But of course, it's an independent institute. The fact that it is dependent upon government funding does not compromise its independence in any way. What is one of the major organizations that donates to Pennington? That would be Merck, Sharp, and Domi. Oh, a drug company. How about that? And no conflict of interest there. Oh, and Camarus is another one, is another leading organizational donor. And who are Camarus? According to Wikipedia, it's a Swedish research-based pharmaceutical and biotechnology company specializing in the commercialization of medicines for treating serious and chronic diseases. In other words, go opiates. Yeah. I guess we're going to be hearing a lot more about this. It's all harm reduction, right? Except that harm reduction doesn't. It simply doesn't. Harm reduction has been, what, official, semi-official policy for, what, 25 years now? And what have we seen with overdoses? Going like that. Going like that. Which brings me to Theodore Dalrymple's book, Romancing Opiates. I believe it was called Junk Medicine in the UK. Theodore Dalrymple, quite a remarkable man, born 1949. His actual name is Anthony Daniels, and he is a physician. He worked for many years in prisons in Britain, and he's a psychiatrist. And he is a Stakhanovite writer, I must say. He's written an enormous number of books, including Life at the Bottom, The Worldview That Makes the Underclass, Our Culture, What's Left of It, and Spoilt Rotten, The Toxic Cult of Sentimentality. He says that he chose the name that sounded suitably dyspeptic, that of a gouty old man looking out of the window of his London club, port in hand, lamenting the degenerating state of the world. He has traveled extensively into the world, including a lot of rather nasty places. And he has a home in France, as well as one in England. He said a very interesting thing about moving to France, that he said that people told me that France is, decadent, that it's not the country that it was. And he said that might be true. But you see, I really had little knowledge of the old France, so I'm not in a position to appreciate the decadence. This is common to everyone who moves. When I moved to Victoria 20 years ago this month, it was so thrilling compared to what Vancouver had become. Not so thrilling anymore, but I'm sure that if I talked to people who lived their whole lives in Victoria, oh no, you should have been here 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, or whatever. But change and decay all around I see, as the hymn tune goes. The full title of this book is Romancing Opiates, Pharmacological Lies, and the Addiction Bureaucracy. Because you see, with the overdose day, that this has become a racket. That's all it is, simply a racket. This book was published originally by Encounter in 2006, which is 15 years ago. The only thing that has changed since then is that the harm reduction movement has become ever stronger. Oh, I suppose also the police in Western countries have, well, especially in Canada, and I know this is true in Britain and other places, they've simply stopped trying to uphold the law with regard to illegal drugs. He begins with a quotation from Charles Mackay, author of Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. Man, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly, one by one. Dalrymple comments, man is the only creature capable of self-destruction, and only man decides in full consciousness to do what is bad, even fatal for him. Freud's death wish may be mere speculation, an abstract construct conjured from the air, but no one with the slightest acquaintance with the human race could possibly conclude that human beings always pursue their own best interests by means of rational calculation. The primrose path to perdition never ceases to attract. Not least among the attractions of the primrose path are drugs of abuse. This has always been so and will always be so. The temptation to obscure life's existential difficulties, dissatisfactions, and terrors by means of chemically induced oblivion has always been and will always be great, at least until the meaning of life has been found once and for all. Romancing Opiates draws the appropriate conclusion from this, that addiction to opiates is a pretend rather than a real illness, treatment of which is pretend rather than real treatment. How and why addicts came to lie to doctors, how and why doctors came to return the compliment, and how and why society in general swallowed the lies wholesale. Not everyone yields to temptation, however, nor is the proportion of the population that does so constant in time or place. Our underlying anxieties about life may remain always the same. If this were not so, the literature of the past would hardly have any meaning for us, but our response to them is not always the same. It is affected by, among other things, the purpose that we choose to give our lives. During the past 14 years, I've worked as a doctor in a large general hospital in a British slum and in the even larger prison next door. In that, I have seen addiction to opiates, principally heroin, rise from an infrequently encountered problem to a mass phenomenon. Indeed, it has become so widespread that the City Council has now put a request that citizens not put their used needles and syringes in the black plastic bags that it distributes to households for garbage collection. And no stairwell in a public housing project is quite complete without the discarded paraphernalia of intravenous drug abuse. No doubt the sudden increase in the number of heroin users in my city was multifactorial, to use the word favored by epidemiologists, when the proximate cause of a phenomenon is still unknown to them or anyone else. In all probability, the supply of heroin to the city became much greater and more secure, but no supply would or could have expanded so quickly unless it met its corresponding demand. The demand derived principally from disaffected adolescents and young adults who've been brought up to believe that the immediate satisfaction of personal desires was the highest, indeed the only good, but whose economic prospects were, relatively speaking, grim, and who would never be able to fulfill their fantasies of a luxurious existence. Such young people were without the spiritual consolation of religion or the distraction of a deep and satisfying culture. Reverie followed by oblivion was therefore their utopia. Even among young Britons of a higher social class and with better career prospects than the most typical drug addict, it is now common to hear the evening before extolled as a wonderful social event because the person extolling it was so drunk that he is now unable to remember anything whatever about it. This suggests a sub-Buddhist pessimism about the possibilities of human existence. I'll just break in to say that long ago, I coined the phrase that heroin addiction is a form of chemical Buddhism because it obliterates the person. There's just, nirvana results. Now, I suppose having worked with these people, heroin addicts, for many years, Dalrymple learned the most important thing about them, that they are liars and that they will never stop lying, never stop lying about anything. Now, I suppose I have a personal interest in this now because I see a great many heroin addicts outside literally my front door or through my window. And the number of them in Victoria is growing at an enormous rate, or so it seems to me. And I am noticing people a great many people who have become so physically degenerate that one expects them to, fall apart before one's eyes. And Dalrymple has something similar. The condition in which the addicts arrived in the prison was pitiable. I had in my time traveled through many countries devastated by massacre and civil war, but I was still shocked by what I saw. At a time of economic prosperity, there were many young men who were quite literally on the edge of starvation. It would not be an exaggeration, but the plainest of plain description to say that many of them looked as if they had just been liberated from a concentration camp. Hollow-chested and stick-limbed, they also suffered from vitamin deficiencies. Their tongues were the shiny, smooth magenta purple of vitamin B deficiency. The corners of their mouths were cracked. Their skins were pocked by sores. If any director wanted extras for a film about a concentration camp, he would need to look no further than the daily entrance to British prisons. I used to remark to such young men that if they were released from prison in the condition in which they entered it, everyone would conclude, and rightly, that we were running not a prison but a concentration camp. Therefore, I said, it was only reasonable to conclude that for them, Freedom was a concentration camp. Their own desires acted as the concentration camp guards. Badly educated as they were, lacking almost all knowledge of history or interest in current events, not a single one of them ever failed to understand what I meant, and they always laughed. They agreed with what I said. Freedom was bad for them because they did not know what to do with it. In fact, the great majority of them stopped taking opiates in the prison even when they were available. They were smuggled in by various methods, the most unscrupulous and emblematic of which was the use of little packets of heroin placed in the rectums of babies brought on prison visits by the prisoners' girlfriends, and which would have killed the baby had they burst. In this milieu, of course, there are always other babies, where approximately this one came from. The addicts came into the prison starving and miserable and went out healthy and happy. Within a few months, however, many of them were back to their former condition, and not a few of them begged the courts, when brought once more before them, to imprison them rather than let them go free. A strange world indeed, in which incarceration is preferable to freedom. Now, it's a curious thing when you look at heroin addicts, daily users, perennial daily users, that this is such a miserable existence that why would anyone want to do so? Well, you see in music, oh, well, yes, John Coltrane was a junkie, and after he stopped using, his music wasn't as good. You see variations of this. Oh, Keith Richards was a junkie, and look at all the great music he wrote. Well, when Keith Richards truly became a junkie, he was incapable of writing music or pretty much playing the guitar anymore. He would nod out playing guitar. He would just fall asleep on stage. And of course, you have the sad case of Kurt Cobain. You look at so many of these people, I mean, it truly does seem to be a death wish. One of the myths that Dalrymple explodes is, oh, how did you become a heroin addict? Oh, I just sort of fell into it. Or, it was around. Oh, well, lots of things are around. That doesn't mean you start doing them. It is not possible to fall into heroin addiction. It takes a sustained effort. It's been a commonplace for decades. Why do people use heroin? Oh, because the high is unlike anything else. And you say that, and you're supposedly trying to get people to not use heroin. Well, since the high, or at least, in the early days, is associated with vomiting, again, this is something you have to work at. I'm always amused when I read these stories about young people, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, people associated with the entertainment industry. Oh, that they're alcoholics. Well, the Dane Commission wrote, it takes about 20 years of drinking to get into a situation where there are stark physiological dangers to not drinking. 20 years. That is a long slog. And similarly with heroin use, there are people who use heroin occasionally. And of course, he famously mentions De Quincey, Confessions of an Opium Eater, every Saturday night. Oh, so that you used opium once a week and somehow you weren't tempted to start using it daily or several times daily? No. And there's lots of people who, the price of heroin, well, there's been a big change in the nature of heroin that is sold. Going back to, the 1970s, it was very low quality. It was full of dangerous impurities, and it was quite expensive. Well, there's so much heroin being imported to the West now that it is, about twice as pure, at least twice as pure as it used to be, no longer so dangerous. And in fact, it is so strong that that people can smoke or snort this stuff and get the same high that people got in the 1970s by injecting it. but people still insist on injecting it, despite the horrible damage this does and the great medical risks of infections and broken veins and people being reduced to, shooting into their eyeballs. It's just absolutely remarkable. And, the only conclusion here is that there's some people who want to wreck their lives and by extension, the lives of others. Dalrymple writes, the addict was to be seen purely and simply as an ill person, and this meant that taking heroin was something that just happened to people rather than something that they did. In the process of turning the addict into a blameless patient, therefore, the doctors, nurses, psychologists, counselors, and social workers also turned an addict into something less than a fully responsible person, into someone not in charge of his own behavior, a creature or automaton effectively without choices, intentions, or even weaknesses. So uncertain of their own benevolence were these functionaries of care that they avoided all mention of the moral and spiritual aspects of addiction, since even to mention them en passant was to risk being perceived as condemnatory and therefore malevolent in intent. In this odd little subculture, which nevertheless echoes prevalent attitudes outside itself, only those who approve of, or at least do not express disapproval of, other people's behavior can consider themselves or be considered by others to be generous-minded. Yes, we have to erase the stigma around drug use. Well, we've done a pretty good job of that, and what has been the result? That the number of heroin users and the number of fatal overdoses has exploded. Social sanctions are as powerful or perhaps even more powerful than legal sanctions. But of course, social sanctions are considered a very, very bad thing. The libertarians have failed utterly in the political realm, but they have triumphed in the social realm. It's not even a question anymore of banning things which have been proved to be bad in many ways. Criticizing people for doing destructive things is now considered wicked. This is the moral inversion of which the Hungarian Polanyi wrote of. And so we listen to the junkies, but the junkies are liars. Oh, they can't quit because heroin withdrawal is just the most harrowing thing in the world. Well, as Dalrymple demonstrates, it isn't. Nowhere close. It's certainly nowhere close to being weaned off extreme alcohol dependency. And studies have been done in which people, their drug was swapped out, their opiate was swapped out with saline solution, and no change was observed in them. They thought that they were getting their dope, and so they were happy. And this process works in reverse as well. In Asian countries, they throw people in prisons. And a few days later, they let them out. And they are no longer addicted to the drug. But of course, the very term addiction, it's not very efficacious. Because as others, including Thomas Zaz, have pointed out, any substance which people like is going to be abused, and this is going to be referred to as an addiction. For instance, we hear about food addiction now, and we hear about sexual addiction. But this is all psychological. People keep doing it because they want to do it. And Dalrymple, he mentions that one does not find this dependency, this addiction, on people who have been given, considerable doses of opiates as painkillers for post-operative pain. No, the pain goes away, they're let out of the hospital, and then they're not abusing opiates. But drug addicts will say whatever they think is necessary in order to get more of the drug. And they're increasingly dealing with people who don't want to hurt their feelings. Don't want to hurt their feelings. And it's all about harm reduction now. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that harm reduction works. I mean, obviously, we have many fewer arrests. Well, let's see, as early as the 1990s, one of the TV stations in Victoria set up a camera on the roof of a building near Main and Hastings in Vancouver. And in an alley across the street, there's pretty much an open-air drug market. Now, the police obviously knew about this, especially since their headquarters is pretty much right around the corner. They did nothing about it. Nothing about it. Another myth that Dalrymple explodes is that, well, you see, the criminalization of heroin use is bad for society because heroin addicts must steal and rob in order to support their fix. Well, the studies show that heroin addicts, the vast majority of them, were already criminals before they started using heroin. Let's see what Dalrymple has to say about harm reduction. The object of treatment, so-called, is either the abstention of the addicted person, or if that proves to be impossible, again, I use the word metaphorically, harm reduction. This means that if a person insists upon taking heroin by intravenous injection, you provide him with the needles and syringes so that he should not suffer the transmissible diseases from needles and syringes used by other addicts. In Canadian prisons recently, the authorities have offered to provide prisoners with tattoos to prevent them from tattooing themselves, a procedure that involves risk. They must, however, choose non-racist, non-violent designs. This policy certainly seems to reduce the chances of an addict contracting HIV or hepatitis B and C if a person persists in taking opiates and in committing crime to obtain the money to pay for them. You provide him with free opiates so that he commits no more crime, and so on and so forth, always in the direction of accommodation of the habit, of course. Now, speaking of the useless Canadian media, it was buried in the story about legalization of drugs. It was buried well within the story that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had said, no, Canada is not going to legalize all drugs. There's been a growing movement in Canada for the legalization, or at least the decriminalization of all drugs. Trudeau said, no, I do not agree with this. And then several paragraphs down, the Canadian government is now providing free, top-quality heroin to people. So heroin has effectively been legalized. And they're getting it here in Victoria. They're getting it across the street from where I live, with the results which I have described to you, where people who, they look like they're, from The Walking Dead, and they're bent in half. I see them shuffling in the street, and some of them, almost jackknifed. But no, let's keep giving these people heroin. Dalrymple continues, the addict is not to be confronted directly with the consequences of his own actions in modern society. We want our risk and our safety too. It is the modern equivalent of eating one's cake and having it. The benefits of what is called risk reduction are tangible, or at least measurable. The benefits of refusing to reduce risks are intangible or philosophical, though it is possible in the long run that they would translate into tangible or measurable ones. When self-indulgent actions, such as taking heroin, are deprived of some of the worst consequences, it is hardly to be wondered at that they spread like wildfire through a population. If consequences are removed from enough actions, then the very concept of human agency evaporates. Life itself becomes meaningless, and it is thenceforth a vacuum in which people oscillate between boredom and oblivion. They have nothing to hope for and nothing to fear. They are more likely to seek the intermittent oblivion of opiate addiction. Harm reduction as a policy is inherently infantilizing of the population. It assumes that the authorities are and ought to be reasonable for the ill consequences of what people insist upon doing. A recent case in a Canadian women's prison illustrates this. A prisoner addicted to opiates was given a dose of methadone to prevent her from suffering, but so slight was the suffering that she anticipated, no doubt from her previous experience from withdrawal from opiates, the suffering that supposedly justified the prescription in the first place, that she voluntarily vomited up her methadone to give it, or more likely to sell it, to another prisoner who was not an addict. The latter drank the former's vomit and died as a consequence. Who was to blame? The prison authorities, of course. The relatives of the deceased immediately sued them. There is thus no reasonable expectation that people should not drink one another's vomitus, or that, if they do, they should take the consequences themselves. We are all children, and the authorities are our parents. This is utilitarianism made policy. It infantilizes the subject, however, and treats him as if he were not responsible for his own actions. In fact, experience shows that the subject is not quite such as an automaton as is often made out. For example, in the prison in which I work, the vast majority of heroin addicts who inject themselves with the drug gave up injecting because clean needles are not available to them, and they are aware of the dangers of injecting with needles that others have already used. This suggests that at the very least, prisoners are conscious and indeed self-conscious beings. Of course, a small number of such addicts continue to inject, putting themselves at risk, and it is this small minority upon whom policymakers, always biased in favor of more official intervention, focus their attention. There is nothing an official hates more than a person who makes up his own mind. He talks about methadone here. The idea of the most common method of treatment, it would be tedious to put this term always in quotation marks, but I hope the reader will take them as read, is the substitution of heroin for a drug called methadone. This substance, which is most often taken in syrup form, but is also available as an injection and as pills, is a synthetic opiate first developed in Germany just before the beginning of the Second World War. The most commonly accepted, though not necessarily true, version of its invention is that the Nazis, fearing that their supply of natural opiates would be cut off during hostilities, and aware that Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring was a morphine addict liable to withdrawal symptoms if his supply of heroin was interrupted, asked the German pharmaceutical industry to develop a synthetic opiate that freed Germany from the need to import and Göring from his fears. I wonder if a campaign could be started against methadone, saying this and calling it a Nazi drug. I suppose all the Antifa types might be put off by it. A methadone has a long half-life. That is to say, it takes a relatively long time for the body to metabolize and excrete it. Thus, it produces its effects over 24 hours or more and is taken but once a day, whereas the effects of heroin last only a few hours, so that the addict may take it up to 3 or 4 times daily. It is said not to produce the euphoria that heroin produces, which from the point of view of treatment, though not from the addict's point of view, is also said to be an advantage. Here, of course, there is a contradiction, for it is often associated that opiate addicts, once they have become addicted to the drug, experience no euphoria, but continue to take their drug only in order to feel normal, that is to say, not in a state of withdrawal. In this way, they are exculpated from the charge of irresponsible hedonism, of actually enjoying their wretched habit of robbing and burgling to pay for their pleasure. Robbing and burgling to avoid their pain seems somehow so much more meritorious, or at least less reprehensible, than robbing and burgling to enjoy for a few hours a fool's paradise. But in actual fact, many addicts will admit that they continue to derive pleasure from heroin, and that is precisely why they continue. When a heroin addict is prescribed methadone, the object is to stabilize his life. Therefore, it is hoped he will cease or at least reduce his consumption of heroin and all the behavior necessary to obtain it. This will reduce his chances of contracting HIV and hepatitis B and C. Of course, this applies only to those who inject heroin. Those who smoke it are at no greater risk of infection with these viruses than non-addicts. Finally, his supply of methadone being either free or very cheap, he will no longer feel the need to commit crime to feed his habit, as the cant phrase has it. The idea of methadone substitution has become virtually an unassailable orthodoxy. The subject, for example, of a National Institute of Health consensus statement, which occupies roughly the same position in the mental economy of the medical profession as a papal bull in that of the clergy in pre-Reformation Europe. But the logic of it all seems to me to be distinctly flawed, at least when instituted as social policy. The success, at least partial, of treating heroin addicts with methadone, and and the fact that there is a dose-response curve, that is to say, the higher the dose, the stronger the effect, suggests to the addiction establishment that heroin addiction is therefore a bona fide medical condition, what one paper in the New England Journal of Medicine called a chronic relapsing disorder, rather like gout perhaps, or rheumatoid arthritis, the cause of whose fluctuations is as yet unknown. Let us then perform a little thought experiment. Suppose we had a population of burglars whom we divided into two. Admittedly, the experiment could not easily be double-blind. The first group, when caught, receives $10 million. The second is given conventional treatment, i.e. jail. It would not be very unlikely or difficult to establish that the first group's rate of recidivism or relapse, to give crime a medical cast, would be very much lower than the second group's, at least until the money ran out. Of course, as with methadone treatment, the response would not be 100%, but because there are doubts, no doubt some burglars who do it for the sheer hell, that is to say, the joy of it. But it would also be possible to show a dose-response curve. $500 might prevent relapse for a week, $5,000 for a month, and so on and so forth. Moreover, you could fiddle around with the treatment ad infinitum, giving burglars benefits in kind, for example, furniture and groceries, or fast-red sports cars, or free subscription to a fuel station. Some treatments would undoubtedly work better than others. Some would not work at all. Would this make burglary disease? It would appear that the attempt to substitute methadone for heroin, well, it's not worked. And clearly, the elite has decided to largely abandon this when they've decided that the government should give free top-quality heroin to people. I think this is a very important book. And I think that every politician, civil servant who is involved in this subject should read it, or perhaps be forced to read it. But one comes away with this book with a rather startling and depressing conclusion that our elite has decided in as many ways as possible to make the lives of ordinary people as miserable as possible. Don't like crazy people on the street screaming at you, demanding God knows what from you. Don't like to see people urinating or defecating on the streets. Don't have to step over people sprawled on the streets, or listen to them screaming obscenities incomprehensibly for minutes, hours at a time. Well, that makes you a bad person. Now, the fact that none of these things which I just mentioned existed, or they existed at a very lower level 10, 20 years ago, should demonstrate something to our policymakers, that turning a blind eye from blight is going to result in more blight. But as mentioned earlier in this live stream, there are some people who think that we are near the end in terms of the hegemony of our current elite. One can only hope that the transfer of power is a peaceful one. Let's have a final look at the chat. Okay. How powerful? Okay. More than 3 days running, you will be sick when you stop, says Chokokin 666. What prisons did he work at? Well, he worked at a prison. The one that he's referring to in the book is in Birmingham. And Chogo, sexist feral hog, says Chogo, 3 days. Really? Yeah, I don't know. There's this movie, The French Connection 2, which was directed by John Frankenheimer. And there's a part of the plot. This is preposterous. The policeman, our hero, he gets kidnapped by the drug dealers, and he's put in a cell, and he's injected with heroin regularly. And so when he leaves, he's going to be a junkie, and he's not going to be any good as a cop anymore. The premise is preposterous. In real life, our hero would consider this to have been a nightmare. And after he gets out of prison, well, yeah, I'm just going to put that behind me. But nope. We say a similar thing in the unit as well. Oh, just a few injections of this ultra powerful, super addictive heroin, literally just a few. And our hero, Bob, he's just a different man. He's crippled when he returns stateside. Just absolutely preposterous. KMG's neighborhood is getting on his nerves, says Texas Feral Hug. It would get on anyone's nerves. Topcasso 88 says, as a young man, I supported legalizing all drugs in middle age. I shake my head at how wrong I was. I had similar views. I suppose part of it was my exposure at an early age to the writings. I read all of his books, Thomas Saz. I reasoned at the time that, if these people want to destroy their lives, let them do it. And then, of course, I realized that it's not that simple, because they're not just destroying their lives, they're destroying the lives of others, and they are costing society and governments an enormous amount of money. Only the Ubermensch can take drugs and grow stronger, says Texas Feral Hog. As Dalrymple says in his book, there are many people to this day who occasionally use heroin and do not become addicted. Emma Nimpton says, my best friend from high school died from a fentanyl OD. Pelpicasso 88 says, if you want to see what long-term drug use does to someone, look at Artie Lang, his nose caved in from snorting coke laced with ground glass. Well, when cocaine, I was around when cocaine started to become popular in the late 1970s. And most of my friends were musicians. So there was a lot of cocaine use. And I mentioned this before, but I found the marijuana culture tiresome. I've never used any illegal drugs, by the way, because of this need to share, communal bonding experience. But with cocaine, it was very much different, because cocaine is very expensive and, frequently unprocurable. So cocaine was not a drug that you shared with everyone. I'd be at a party and I'd notice eyes being turned, one person looking at another person returning the gaze, and I'd see two people leave the room, one after the other, maybe decent interval, and they'd come back about 15 or 20 minutes later laughing like hyenas. And I thought, golly, I wonder what they were doing. And the need for a drug which makes you feel like God, obviously the come down from that drug is going to be dire, and indeed it is. And I have seen one experience, a friend of mine who was on a 3-day coke jag, and then he couldn't get any more coke. He spent the entire day in his apartment on his couch, so depressed that he couldn't move. And that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. One of the side effects of opiate use in hospitals for pain control, Jim Kunstler has written about this, that for quite some time one cannot urinate. This has been observed, since opium was brought to the West, by the Chinese in the 19th century. That, take opium and you can't urinate. Now, I've never had that experience, but others have described it as excruciating. So, doesn't that happen to Philip Marlowe in Murder My Sweet, says Steve Costanza? I have read Murder My Sweet, maybe twice. I don't recall that. Okay. So what's coming up next week, or just generally on the show? On Theater Thursday, I'm going to be discussing John Ford's 1945 classic about the war against Japan, They Were Expendable. On September 2nd, a fine documentary by Figueroa and Knudsen from 2013 on John Milius called Milius. September 9th, the first time I have essayed one of the works of the French genius Jacques Tati, his 1967 film, a satire of the future, called Playtime. And on September 16th, Paul Verhoeven's 1997 satire of fascism, Starship Troopers. Of course, the American critics, who are idiots, all said, wow, this movie's pretty fascist. And I thought, when Doogie Howser shows up wearing that Yusuf Goebbels greatcoat, do you get it yet? No, they didn't get it because they're thickos. And coming up on the book club, next Friday, I'm going to be discussing Francis Ween's fine biography of Karl Marx. September 3rd, a book about being young in America by Bad Billy Pratt called Welcome to Hell. On September 10th, a classic, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain by Bernal Diaz. And on September 17th, a book by Professor Robert Edgerton called Six Societies, which is a riposte to the cultural relativism. And on Music Monday, I'm going to be, on August 23rd, next Monday, I'm going to be talking about the life and death of Art Rock. On August 30th, Bach's Sons. On September 6th, Stan Ridgway, American Great. And on September 13th, The Child Ballads in Song. So, thank you all for tuning in. I'll be back in the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to make a donation to this live stream, which would be much appreciated and sorely needed, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.